I didn't actually work at Wembley only to the extent that when we were producing a show which I was involved, I'd go out to Wembley. So I spent a fair amount of time out there, but I was based at Television House. I joined Rediffusion in 19, April 1955. Um, I had been working a couple of years earlier for Steve Reese, who was a musician and broadcaster. And he was also, when he was in the Air Force, he did pop music concertos with the Halley Orchestra. And when Sir John Barbarolli got the job as music advisor for Rediffusion, his manager smartly said, "Well, we'll form the music. Does all your music." And because I'd worked with Steve, he was taken on their board. I became basically the music manager of the music section and set up the live, set up for records, and sheet music, and so on, and scores. And the first 2 years, from 55 to 57, I was manager of music. 57, the company was folded into Fusion, and I then folded into Light Entertainment as assistant head. I was temporary acting head of Light Entertainment very briefly when Alan Morris was sick. But I then put onto quiz programs, the manager of quiz programs, and I was a producer of Double Your Money, the Huey Green series, on and off for 3 or 4 years. And I was supervising High on Take Your Pick, the Michael Miles series. Then I went to children's programs for a year and a half, from September 58 to March of 60. And then in 62, I left and went freelance and left Rediffusion. Well, Huey Green was half Canadian and half Scottish. And he had always, he and his wife separated, and Claire came back to Canada with the kids. And Huey always wanted to be successful in Canada as he hadn't been in Britain. So he tried through his John Heyman to arrange to do pilots of Canadian versions of Your Money and an Australian version. And in the space of about a month in 1964, I produced pilots of Double Your Money in Toronto and Sydney, Australia. Fortunately, we didn't sell the show to Australia, otherwise it was there as well. But we did sell it to CTV here in Canada, and I commuted for 6 or 7 months producing episodes of Double Your Money right across the country in 6 or 7 of the major cities. And when the series wasn't renewed, I was asked by the people at CTV, the private network, what I was going to be doing. I said, well, I'm going to be producing Double Your Money for radio, Radio Luxembourg, such salubrious places as Hull, Wigan, and Scunthorpe. But I really loved it in Canada. I've been across the country 2 or 3 times, and if there was a job here, I'd be very happy to think about it. So I said, well, we're looking for an executive producer in Montreal. Would you be interested in working there? And I said, so I got married to Elizabeth Kingdon, who was the hostess on Take Your Pick, the other show I was involved with. And we came out in August of 65, and been here ever since. Okay, well, no, when independent television finally arrived and people were invited to apply for licenses, one of the applicants was the combination of Associated Newspapers and Rediffusion, who were known for wiring buildings with radio and so on, and had a great international presence, and money, which obviously needed to be invested in large sums. So Associated-Rediffusion was formed, and they got the London license for Monday through Friday. Lou Grade's company got the weekends in London and the Midlands, and ABC got the Midlands weekdays, and Granada got the North, and so on. So they split it up into several regions, all of which came on the air over the space of 2, 3, or 4 years from 1955 on. The studios, they had Rediffusion started out. They bought Wembley Studio. Now I was obviously fairly low down on the power chain in that time and ever since. And so I wasn't actively involved in the machinations that went on, but I'm reasonably aware about the background. And obviously, rediffusion, as they got to be known, AR as they were until Associated newspapers dropped out quite early on. But AR bought the Wembley Studios because they needed studios to produce programs bigger than the talk shows and the children's things they could do in the basement of Television House. And so they bought Wembley Studios, and that was the main studio where they produced variety series, the game shows, the dramas, the musical shows, and so on. Well, by the time I was involved to any degree, it would have been 2 years in because I did go out to the studios 2 or 3 times to supervise recordings by orchestras, which used, I think it was Studio One at Wembley. Um, so I was aware of the facility and I spent some time out there. Uh, I had never seen it as a film studio. They did a very good job of converting it. Rediffusion AR essentially was a business company that got into production and television. ATV, because it had Lou Grade behind it, was into entertainment already. ABC were into entertainment because of their film background. But Rediffusion was really a business company that learned about television, and to get on the road, it essentially, probably more than anybody else, hired a lot of BBC people to head up the various departments and do the various things that needed doing. And so their approach was very businesslike, and they obviously realized as the further they went on that they would need to be producing more and bigger and more expensive programs in order to please the Independent Television Authority and thereby get their license renewed. And so that involved an expenditure as they progressed and found that they were doing well with drama and maybe even making a little money on it, that they could use a much bigger studio, which of course could be rented out to others maybe later on. And so they elected to invest in Studio 5. It would have been a dream or a figment of someone's imagination in the early days when they lost millions of pounds over the first 2 years. And there were all kinds of firings and downsizings and right sizing and other euphemistic things until they got it sorted out. And then, of course, it became what Lord Thompson, another Canadian, described as a license to print money. And that was when they could afford to do something like Studio 5. Oh, absolutely, and you're right. The competition that used to go on, and I wasn't party to these, but the program controllers would have their weekly or monthly meetings to decide what programs they were going to produce and who would take them. Because remember, they were all separate organizations. There was no one national entity. If Rediffusion produced a drama series, that would be on in London from Monday to Friday. Would ATV take it for the Midlands on play it there on weekends? Would Granada play it for the North? There were all kinds of trade-offs and arguments and fights and to get stuff on the air. So it was a very competitive environment, and this was one way that Associated-Rediffusion felt they could fight back and have some increased stature with these showbiz people who might try and pull the wool over their eyes and grab all the airtime. Well, the great thing about ITV in general, and Associated-Rediffusion in particular, because it's the company I know more about, was that although a lot of the people who came from BBC had pardon, that's a Canadian slipper, people who came from the BBC were already somewhat versed in television. Television was still in its younger days, let's face it, even then. There was still a wonderful atmosphere of pioneering. You were doing so many things for the first time they'd been done. You could screw up and it would be all right unless you did it too often. But the first time, everybody was learning. So there was that mutual sense of working to achieve something together, and there was a series of small victories in whatever area, in, in production, in casting, in costuming, in the finance department. They were proud of because they were involved to whatever degree. But that whole atmosphere permeated Associated-Rediffusion for all the time I was there, even through some of the downsizings. There was the people who stayed were relieved. I was what made the company decided to have a major live production of an Arabian Night, which was of course was incredibly elaborate, involving not only people but animals, which did what animals were expected to do sooner or later in studios, and the whole atmosphere was. And remember, this was live. We weren't taping things to broadcast later. Everything had to be live. The actors' performances, the animals' performances, everything was happening live at that moment. So there was a greater degree of tension involved in programming like that than later shows of such elaborate nature. Um, to celebrate it, again to underline what a great company it was and what a great job it was doing, the company invited couple of hundred maybe major guests, MPs, political people, anybody who might be of assistance to them, the senior executives of the various suppliers of materials for the company to operate. They were all invited, and there was in one studio was laid out as a dining room, and they had a member of Rediffusion staff at every table as a host. And I was one of the hosts, invited to be one of the hosts, and I had a table of guests. Um, we were very, very unpopular, and I say we because they elected to use management people. I was a manager of a section at the time, and the directors who would be using the studios a lot more managers were very, very unhappy that they weren't invited to be the hosts. I remember Cyril Coke, who was one of the major drama directors and a very good friend of mine, was very, very teed off that he and his colleagues weren't invited to host the guests. And he was probably right. I mean, but anyway, we did a pretty good job. We had been briefed in advance that we took each of our groups on a tour of the studio area before the show. We didn't take them on the actual floor because there were viewing galleries above so they could see into the studio and see what was happening. And so we did that, and we had hosted them to dinner, and then they went to a particular area to watch the show. And all of that was incredibly dramatic and cost a lot of money, but I think the company thought it was worth doing, and the production came off. I don't think it would exactly be a ratings booster, but it was a very well done production, and we and everybody involved had every right to be proud of it. I think uh, everybody sort of made up television as they went along to a large degree. Everybody was still learning new things. Uh, People didn't know the technologies that exist now for simple things like doing credits at the end of a show, where in the past, even in those days, they were probably pulling bits of card with people's names inked in on them, as opposed to having rolling credits and all kinds of stuff that came along later. So I don't know that anybody was thinking that much further ahead. I don't know that the companies had enough money to pay people just to be thinkers, as opposed to doing practical things like hauling dollies of equipment and running cameras and running sound. So there wasn't a sense of, oh, look at what we can do now, that permeated the whole building or the whole company. But there were probably the backroom people who had those thoughts in mind, but it wasn't something that was overt. Well, it is, of course, always sad when something like this happens, but particularly when you've lived as long as I have, you've become used to the evolution of to the point where money is what talks in the end. If a piece of property could be more valuable than something else, even though I look out of my window at houses that are all brand new because the houses that were there have been pulled down. They were bought at a price that was reasonable, but the people who bought them were not only going to get rid of that money by buying the house, it wasn't going to be any value except as the piece of land. And I have to assume that the economics of leaving Studio 5 where it was, with presumably the enormous growth of other comparable production facilities or even better production facilities from a technological point of view, because they were built 20, 30, 40, 50 years later with new technologies in mind, the adaptation of an older building probably didn't make as much sense as demolishing it.